and that's one of the reasons for its strength is both an individualizing and a totalizing form of power. Never, I think, in the history of human societies, even in the old Chinese society has there been such a tricky combination in the same political structures of individualization techniques and of totalization procedures. This is due to the fact that the modern Western state has integrated in a new political shape an old power technique which originated in Christian institutions. We can call this power technique the pastoral power. First of all, a few words about this pastoral power. It has often been said that Christianity brought into being a code of ethics fundamentally different from that of the ancient world. Less emphasis is usually placed on the fact that it proposed and spread new power relations throughout the ancient world. Christianity is the only religion which has organized itself as a church, and as such, it postulates in principle that certain individuals can, by their religious quality, serve others not as princes, magistrates, prophets, fortune-tellers, benefactors, educationalists, and so on but as pastors. However, this word designates a very special form of power. 1. It is a form of power whose ultimate aim is to assure individual salvation in the next world. 2. Pastoral power is not merely a form of power which commands, it must also be prepared to sacrifice itself for the life and salvation of the flock. Therefore, it is different from royal power, which demands a sacrifice from its subjects to save the throne. 3. It is a form of power which does not look after just the whole community but each individual in particular, during his entire life. 4. Finally, this form of power cannot be exercised without knowing the inside of people's minds, without exploring their souls, without making them reveal their innermost secrets. It implies a knowledge of the conscience and an ability to direct it. This form of power is salvation-oriented, as opposed to political power. It is oblative, as opposed to the principle of sovereignty. It is individualizing, as opposed to legal power. It is coextensive and continuous with life. It is linked with the production of truth, the truth of the individual himself. But all this is part of history. You will say, the pastorate has, if not disappeared, at least lost the main part of its efficiency. This is true, but I think we should distinguish between two aspects of pastoral power: between the ecclesiastical institutionalization, which has ceased or at least lost its vitality since the 18th century, and its function, which has spread and multiplied outside the ecclesiastical institution. An important phenomenon took place around the 18th century. It was a new distribution, a new organization of this kind of individualizing power. I don't think that we should consider the modern state as an entity which was developed above individuals, ignoring what they are and even their very existence, but, on the contrary, as a very sophisticated structure, in which individuals can be integrated, under one condition, that this individuality would be shaped in a new form and submitted to a set of very specific patterns. In a way, we can see the state as a modern matrix of individualization or a new form of pastoral power. A few more words about this new pastoral power. 1. We may observe a change in its objective. It was no longer a question of leading people to their salvation in the next world but rather ensuring it in this world. And in this context, the word salvation takes on different meanings: health, well-being, that is, sufficient wealth, standard of living, security, protection against accidents. A series of worldly aims took the place of the religious aims of the traditional pastorate, all the more easily because the latter, for various reasons, had followed in an accessory way a certain number of these aims. We only have to think of the role of medicine and its welfare function assured for a long time by the Catholic and Protestant churches too. Concurrently, the officials of pastoral power increased. Sometimes this form of power was exerted by state apparatus or, in any case, by a public institution such as the police. We should not forget that in the 18th century the police force was not invented only for maintaining law and order, nor for assisting governments in their struggle against their enemies, but for assuring urban supplies, hygiene, health, and standards considered necessary for handicrafts and commerce. Sometimes the power was exercised by private ventures, welfare societies, benefactors, and generally by philanthropists. But ancient institutions, for example the family, were also mobilized at this time to take on pastoral functions. It was also exercised by complex structures such as medicine, which included private initiatives with the sale of services on market economy principles, but which also included public institutions such as hospitals. 3. Finally, the multiplication of the aims and agents of pastoral power focused the development of knowledge of man around two roles: 1. Globalizing and quantitative, concerning the population; the other, analytical, concerning the individual. And this implies that power of a pastoral type, which over centuries for more than a millennium had been linked to a defined religious institution, suddenly spread out into the whole social body. It found support in a multitude of institutions. And, instead of a pastoral power and a political power, more or less linked to each other, more or less rival, there was an individualizing tactic which characterized a series of powers, those of the family, medicine, psychiatry, education, and employers. At the end of the 18th century, Kant wrote, in a German newspaper the Berliner Monatsschrift, a short text. The title was Historienaufklärung. It was for a long time, and it is still, considered a work of relatively small importance. But I can't help finding it very interesting and puzzling because it was the first time a philosopher proposed as a philosophical task to investigate not only the metaphysical system or the foundations of scientific knowledge but a historical event. A recent, even a contemporary event. When in 1784 Kant asked, was Historienaufklärung, he meant, what's going on just now? What's happening to us? What is this world, this period, this precise moment in which we are living? Or in other words, what are we as Aufklärer, as part of the Enlightenment? Compare this with the Cartesian question, who am I? I, as a unique but universal and unhistorical subject. I, for Descartes, is everyone, anywhere at any moment. But Kant asks something else: what are we in a very precise moment of history? Kant's question appears as an analysis of both us and our present. I think that this aspect of philosophy took on more and more importance. Hegel, Nietzsche. The other aspect of universal philosophy didn't disappear. But the task of philosophy as a critical analysis of our world is something which is more and more important. Maybe the most certain of all philosophical problems is the problem of the present time and of what we are in this very moment. Maybe the target nowadays is not to discover what we are but to refuse what we are. We have to imagine and to build up what we could be to get rid of this kind of political double bind, which is the simultaneous individualization and totalization of modern power structures. The conclusion would be that the political, ethical, social, philosophical problem of our days is not to try to liberate the individual from the state and from the state's institutions but to liberate us both from the state and from the type of individualization which is linked to the state. We have to promote new forms of subjectivity through the refusal of this kind of individuality which has been imposed on us for several centuries. How is power exercised? For some people, asking questions about the how of power would limit them to describing its effects without ever relating those effects either to causes or to a basic nature. It would make this power a mysterious substance which they might hesitate to interrogate in itself, no doubt because they would prefer not to call it into question. By proceeding this way, which is never explicitly justified, they seem to suspect the presence of a kind of fatalism. But does not their very distrust indicate a presupposition that power is something which exists with three distinct qualities, its origin, its basic nature, and its manifestations? If, for the time being, I grant a certain privileged position to the question of how, it is not because I would wish to eliminate the questions of what and why, rather, it is that I wish to present these questions in a different way. Better still, to know if it is legitimate to imagine a power which unites in itself a what, a why, and a how. To put it bluntly, I would say that to begin the analysis with the how is to suggest that power as such does not exist. At the very least it is to ask oneself what contents one has in mind when using this all-embracing and reifying term. It is to suspect that an extremely complex configuration of realities is allowed to escape when one treads endlessly in the double question, what is power and where does power come from? The little question, what happens, although flat and empirical, once scrutinized is seen to avoid accusing a metaphysics or an ontology of power of being fraudulent. Rather, it attempts a critical investigation into the thematics of power. How? Not in the sense such how does it manifest itself but by what means is it exercised and what happens when individuals exert, as they say, power over others. As far as this power is concerned, it is first necessary to distinguish that which is exerted over things and gives the ability to modify, use, consume, or destroy them. A power which stems from aptitudes directly inherent in the body or relayed by external instruments. Let us say that here it is a question of capacity. On the other hand, what characterizes the power we are analyzing is that it brings into play relations between individuals, or between groups. For let us not deceive ourselves, if we speak of the structures or the mechanisms of power, it is only insofar as we suppose that certain persons exercise power over others. The term power designates relationships between partners, and by that I am not thinking of a zero-sum game but simply, and for the moment staying in the most general terms, of an ensemble of actions which induce others and follow from one another. It is necessary also to distinguish power relations from relationships of communication which transmit information by means of a language, a system of signs, or any other symbolic medium. No doubt communicating is always a certain way of acting upon another person or persons. But the production and circulation of elements of meaning can have as their objective or as their consequence certain results in the realm of power. The latter are not simply an aspect of the former. Whether or not they pass through systems of communication, power relations have a specific nature. Power relations, relationships of communication, and objective capacities should not therefore be confused. This is not to say that there is a question of three separate domains, nor that there is on one hand the field of things, of perfected technique, work, and the transformation of the real, on the other that of signs, communication, reciprocity, and the production of meaning, and finally, that of the domination of the means of constraint, of inequality, and the action of men upon other men. It is a question of three types of relationships which in fact always overlap one another, support one another reciprocally, and use each other mutually as means to an end. The application of objective capacities in their most elementary forms implies relationships of communication, whether in the form of previously acquired information or of shared work. It is tied also to power relations, whether they consist of obligatory tasks, of gestures imposed by tradition or apprenticeship, of subdivisions in the more or less obligatory distribution of labor. Relationships of communication imply finalized activities, even if only the correct putting into operation of elements of meaning, and, by virtue of modifying the field of information between partners, produce effects of power. They can scarcely be dissociated from activities brought to their final term, be they those which permit the exercise of this power, such as training techniques, processes of domination, the means by which obedience is obtained, or those which, in order to develop their potential, call upon relations of power, the division of labor and the hierarchy of tasks. Of course, the coordination between these three types of relationships is neither uniform nor constant. In a given society there is no general type of equilibrium between finalized activities, systems of communication, and power relations. Rather, there are diverse forms, diverse places, diverse circumstances or occasions in which these interrelationships establish themselves according to a specific model. But there are also blocks in which the adjustment of abilities, the resources of communication, and power relations constitute regulated and concerted systems. Take, for example, an educational institution, the disposal of its space, the meticulous regulations which govern its internal life, the different activities which are organized there, the diverse persons who live there or meet one another, each with his own function, his well-defined character. All these things constitute a block of capacity communication power. The activity which ensures apprenticeship and the acquisition of aptitudes or types of behavior is developed there by means of a whole ensemble of regulated communications lessons, questions and answers, orders, exhortations, coded signs of obedience, differentiation marks of the value of each person and of the levels of knowledge, and by the means of a whole series of power processes, enclosure, surveillance, reward and punishment, the pyramidal hierarchy. These blocks, in which the putting into operation of technical capacities, the game of communications, and the relationships of power are adjusted to one another according to considered formulae, constitute what one might call, enlarging a little the sense of the word, disciplines, the empirical analysis of certain disciplines as they have been historically constituted presents for this very reason a certain interest. This is so because the disciplines show, first, according to artificially clear and decanted systems, the manner in which systems of objective finality and systems of communication and power can be welded together. They also display different models of articulation, sometimes giving preeminence to power relations and obedience, as in those disciplines of a monastic or penitential type, sometimes to finalize activities, as in the disciplines of workshops or hospitals, sometimes to relationships of communication, as in the disciplines of apprenticeship, sometimes also to a saturation of the three types of relationship as perhaps in military discipline, where a plethora of signs indicates, to the point of redundancy, tightly knit power relations calculated with care to produce a certain number of technical effects. What is to be understood by the disciplining of societies in Europe since the 18th century is not, of course, that the individuals who are part of them become more and more obedient, nor that they set about assembling in barracks, schools, or prisons, rather, that an increasingly better invigilated process of adjustment has been sought after more and more rational and economic between productive activities, resources of communication, and the play of power relations. To approach the theme of power by an analysis of how is therefore to introduce several critical shifts in relation to the supposition of a fundamental power. It is to give oneself as the object of analysis power relations and not power itself power relations which are distinct from objective abilities as well as from relations of communication. This is as much as saying that power relations can be grasped in the diversity of their logical sequence, their abilities, and their interrelationships. What constitutes the specific nature of power? The exercise of power is not simply a relationship between partners, individual or collective, it is a way in which certain actions modify others. Which is to say, of course, that something called power, with or without a capital letter, which is assumed to exist universally in a concentrated or diffused form, does not exist. Power exists only when it is put into action, even if, of course, it is integrated into a disparate field of possibilities brought to bear upon permanent structures. This also means that power is not a function of consent. In itself it is not a renunciation of freedom, a transference of rights, the power of each and all delegated to a few, which does not prevent the possibility that consent may be a condition for the existence or the maintenance of power. The relationship of power can be the result of a prior or permanent consent, but it is not by nature the manifestation of a consensus. Is this to say that one must seek the character proper to power relations in the violence which must have been its primitive form, its permanent secret, and its last resource? That which in the final analysis appears as its real nature when it is forced to throw aside its mask and to show itself as it really is? In effect, what defines a relationship of power is that it is a mode of action which does not act directly and immediately on others. Instead, it acts upon their actions, an action upon an action, on existing actions or on those which may arise in the present or the future. A relationship of violence acts upon a body or upon things, it forces, it bends, it breaks on the wheel, it destroys, or it closes the door on all possibilities. Its opposite pole can only be passivity, and if it comes up against any resistance, it has no other option but to try to minimize it. On the other hand, a power relationship can only be articulated on the basis of two elements which are each indispensable if it is really to be a power relationship, that the other, the one over whom power is exercised, be thoroughly recognized and maintained to the very end as a person who acts, and that, faced with the relationship of power, a whole field of responses, reactions, results, and possible inventions may open up. Obviously the bringing into play of